Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Flipping the Script, a podcast where we expand on climate change issues in Vancouver, focusing on the voices of those who aren't usually heard in the mainstream news. This will be the final podcast part of our three-part series, so make sure to listen to our first two episodes. Humaira will be leading this episode on the Lower Mainland's heat dome by expanding the homeless crisis and as well as comparing the various strategies mainstream and government sites have come up with in response to the extreme levels of heat that we are facing today. Humaira, if you may begin.
Thank you, and hi everyone. In this episode, I'll be discussing the heat wave in Vancouver during the summer of 2021. I have two objectives in mind for this episode. One being that we are able to acknowledge more marginalized groups, since that is our main goal here on Flipping the Script. And two, that we can do so in a way that upholds media literacy. Media literacy has been one of our main focuses this semester for Communications 120. To those of you who are listening who may be unfamiliar with the term, media literacy involves the ability to decode, evaluate, analyze, and produce both print and electronic media, as well as being able to utilize a skill-based approach consisting of access, analysis, evaluation, and content creation. Media literacy will be especially important for this discussion since it gives us further insight into what may have affected the media coverage for such an event like the heat dome. Now to begin, I'd first like to explain some general facts about the 2021 heat wave that took place in late June to July in British Columbia. Okay, so during the summer of 2021, it was estimated that BC had more than 600 deaths related to extreme levels of heat. Common health concerns include exhaustion, heat stroke, and an increase in incidents related to heart attacks. British Columbians experienced record-breaking heat temperatures, with the all-time high of 49 degrees Celsius in Lytton. As for Vancouver, we were seeing highs of 32 degrees Celsius, which residents were only given about a week to prepare for. This event is one of the first of many heat waves to come in the future. As many of you know, as of July 2022, we are experiencing another heat wave here in Vancouver. While the 2021 heat wave provides us with a level of preparedness for upcoming experiences with extreme heat, in this episode, I'd like to bring awareness to the ways that BC is still not incorporating adequate aid or proper media coverage for more vulnerable groups during these extreme levels of heat. Now, in terms of general awareness on more mainstream news sources, most sites fail to mention the ways that homeless people are part of those who are most vulnerable to extreme heat, such as articles like Vancouver Sun. While academic sources do acknowledge subgroups, I like to bring attention towards the importance of this information being easily accessible for the general public. So to do so, I'd like to first start off with a brief discussion on media coverage and different platforms. So I'd like to ask both of you, on which media platforms did you learn the most about the heat wave, if at all? So that includes social media posts, watching the news, Twitter, etc.
I found that most social media platforms that covered the heat wave, they did not offer any content that would be helpful for those who did not know what to do during these heat disasters. I feel like it was more comedic based, that they were home to more memes and jokes about the heat wave, about everyone suffering, I guess, in a comedic aspect. These platforms pushed the comedic content to the masses, and I felt like they made the situation more tolerable as everyone kind of knew that they weren't the only people suffering. However, I felt like it would have been beneficial if more tips were found on these social media platforms that would help out. I think that news media did a better job at that than social media did.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up how we often use comedy to cope and how this can take away from those who are actually suffering, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic. I'd say it relates to that as well. And I just wanted to ask another question on top of that. So what's the difference between coverage across various platforms that you've noticed?
Yeah, so like I said before, on social media, the coverage was mostly comedic, with everyone kind of letting out their frustrations and misery by making comedic content. It was a place where people could go and interact with other people who were suffering from the same heat dome. On mainstream media and news outlets, their content was centered more towards reporting on the situation and offering some helpful insight here and there. And they also gave people a chance to speak out with interviews on the street as well, which I thought was pretty cool.
Yeah, I agree with Sean's opinions, and the most information I've learned so far is from the news, CBC News. Indeed, in the news coverage, as Sean said, they focus on the current situation and insight. In addition to that, I think the news media like CBC have more official perspective, which can be seen as how the government wants people who read the news to do.
Thank you. Yeah, so bringing us back, I'd like to now focus on news coverage for BC's official government websites. So there is a list that provides various strategies for how to cool down during the extreme heat wave. And these government sites also include community locations that provide air conditioning, such as movie theaters or shopping malls. Now, while these cooling centers are available to the public, they're not ideal locations for homeless residents, especially given the large homeless population in downtown East Side. So, not only are homeless residents being ignored proper aid for extreme levels of heat, but we can consider how anti-homeless architecture in Vancouver may pose a severe threat during heat waves when residents are looking for shade. So a few examples of anti-homeless architecture that you may not be aware of are benches with an unnecessary amount of handrails to stop people from being able to lay down, or even the placement of spikes along empty spaces of concrete. Now, one site that I think provides a great amount of insight into various forms of anti-homeless architecture is the #DefensiveTO project, which we will link in the description below. So this site simply documents defensive or hostile urbanism in Toronto by providing a map that pinpoints the location of each example of anti-homeless architecture. Now, more importantly, it is a community-based project where any person can submit a photo that will be included in their map. So in relation to our discussion of anti-homeless architecture and the heat wave, I think that a simple project like DefensiveTO that brings awareness to matters is a good start for residents of Vancouver. And I think that Vancouver could benefit from a project like such. So given that government sites list strategies that are not viable for homeless residents, it is common for the general public to not even be aware of the ways that homeless people are more vulnerable towards the heat wave. So simple awareness is a good start. Now, in relation to anti-homeless architecture, I'd like to open up our discussion to Shawn and Siyu and ask, what are your thoughts on the DefensiveTO project? And are you able to think about any forms of anti-homeless architecture around Vancouver or BC in general?
Actually, it was only after I saw this project that I realized why I had come across so many tilted benches before, some of which were not even benches, but simply a plank for people to lean on. Yeah, this design seemed to be a clever way for governments to maintain the urban landscape, but there is no doubt that they inconvenience almost all people, because a tilted bench or leaning plank is certainly not as comfortable as a normal bench, and they also compress the living space of the vulnerable people like homeless. I would also like to express my concern about the overuse of defensive architecture. Yeah, let me take an example of a defensive architecture that might be unique in China, especially in rural areas. Yeah, some people will cover the top of a short fence or wall with a thick layer of cement. and then insert many glass fragments while the cement is still wet. However, this is dangerous and is often overused in public because it was very simple to make and everyone used it in various places, so it's now banned, although some people still apply this to their own private property areas.
Yeah, like see you, I realized the truth about these tilted benches only after reading about this project. The intentional defensive design targets people who rely on public spaces the most. I can only imagine how the government will act in trying to eliminate all public spaces for those who are homeless when Vancouver hosts the World Cup in 2026. I know Brazil did some shady stuff when they hosted the World Cup in 2024. They tried to get rid of their homeless population out of their big cities. Even when Russia hosted the Winter Olympics in 2014, they hired an animal control company to catch and kill hundreds of stray dogs roaming the streets. I know that Vancouver hosted the Olympics not too long ago, and I was pretty young then, so I still wonder what they did back then.
Yeah, I'm glad that you guys brought up the discussion, like opening it broader to around the world, especially see with your example of China. I think it does draw into the facts that forms of gentrification take place not only in Vancouver, everywhere. Um, yeah, and I think that relevant to our discussion on how Vancouver is not only driving out our homeless population, we should talk about gentrification. So, as mentioned in the second episode, gentrification is the displacement of lower income residents through the means of catering for the upper class with housing or architectural aspects. Now, in relation to the heat wave, upper class residents may be able to mostly avoid the repercussions of the heat wave while these lower income neighborhoods deal with it at full force. So, with the increased cost of living in Vancouver causing lower income residents to be driven out of homes, there could be a separation of residents based on class. Now, placing higher class residents all in one neighborhood leads to them remaining essentially unscathed from the effects of a phenomenon like the heat wave. And I'd like to now discuss a current example of how homeless residents are being further displaced in a more recent example. So, while mainstream media coverage may lack sufficient aid to help solve the ways that homeless residents are more vulnerable towards extreme heat, their government website does identify that people who are marginally housed are increasingly vulnerable to the heat. Now, this inclusion of a statement like such remains pretty counterproductive given the recent event of Vancouver's Fire Chief Karen Fry ordering the removal of all tents along the stretch of East Hastings Street. Now, this statement was released on July 26, 2022, and orders the removal of tents by Wednesday, July 27. So this was during another predicted heat wave in the lower mainland. So it's important to mention that this was declared based on the road not being easily accessible for fire crews in the case of a fire, but such a demanding during one of the hottest weeks since the summer of 2021, proves that the government's statements regarding homeless people being more vulnerable to the effects of climate change is a rather performative action or statement. Now, before we move on to a few solutions, I'd like to ask both of you, what are other examples of performative actions that you've seen in the Lower Mainland or institutions like school?
I just came to Vancouver not long ago, so maybe I can name any specific examples yet, but I would say that I have been following CBC News, as I said, since I came to Vancouver until now. And thinking back, when I first came to Vancouver, it was still spring, and I didn't see any news about heat waves under the environmental category at that time. But recently, almost every article under this category is about heat. I was most impressed by an article titled heat is killing Canadians or something like that. Yeah, I mean, if it's only taken so seriously every year when the heat wave arrives and there are no reflections and defensive measures in normal times, like in the fall or winter, then the coming heat wave will still arrive just as the same. And as far as I know, there was also a severe heat wave last year. Yeah, I guess this would be a side example of performative action.
Yeah, I feel like the response to the current heat wave we are in was prepared much better by news outlets and social media than last year's heat dome. Last year's heat dome was worse, and it ambushed the residents of British Columbia in a way.
Yeah, thank you guys. So I'd like to open up one of our discussions towards alternative ways for the current ways that the government is reporting the heat wave. So, are there any kinds of alternative solutions that you guys may have, rather than simply acknowledging that a group of people are more vulnerable?
Yeah, in the social resilience section that I mentioned in the first episode, I hope you guys still remember. Yeah, I said that this is a very comprehensive assessment that many indicators of society should be taken into account, and that the homeless are probably one of the most negatively impacted indicators of social resilience in Vancouver, I think. Yeah, as they should be the most sensitive to such extreme climate change or disasters.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the concept of social resilience, because when we think about community activism, it is most difficult for these homeless groups to be given a platform to speak about their issues. It's pretty rare that we are given their point of view during news broadcasting, so I think that a good alternative would be to have a representative that could interview these groups of people to hear their direct input.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting idea, Humaira, about having representatives interview the homeless to hear their direct input. I feel like media sources, especially YouTube, content creators exploit the homeless groups by sticking a camera in their face while doing a good deed for content purposes that isn't as genuine as it should be.
Yeah, thank you. Now, before moving on to my final topic of this episode, I'd like to go back to how mainstream media news sites, such as Vancouver Sun, or even government websites, often lack perspective on reporting about more marginal groups of people. Now, when researching for this topic, I found that a majority of sources did acknowledge such groups, came from more scholarly sources. So, I think it's important to recognize how academia can often gatekeep content that should be available for the general public. Now, in the article, quote how academia, its jargon, gatekeep knowledge, and uphold class case divide, end quote. Anvi discusses how academia often uses academic jargon that would be difficult for someone with a proper education to understand, leaving them out of their discussion. Now, I'd like to come back to the term mentioned earlier, which was media literacy. I think that media literacy provides us with a rather difficult topic, since we can consider how mainstream news sources available to everyone did not provide coverage. The academic articles that do provide coverage have barriers of access. So on the other hand, it is important to be able to recognize that such mainstream news sources are most likely simply reporting on the event while hiding the underlying systemic issues. So I'd just like to open up our discussion. What are your guys' thoughts on media literacy and gatekeeping academic content?
Yeah, when comparing mainstream news sources to academic sources, I do think we need some clarity when it comes to the distribution of news. As you said, Mira, academic sources are much more thorough. However, they are hidden behind barriers of access that are not accessible to everybody. Mainstream news is the much more popular outlet due to its easy accessibility. However, it is not as thorough as academic sources. To uphold media literacy, we need to find a common ground that utilizes the strengths of both mainstream and academic articles while eliminating their downfalls. It may sound like a fairy tale, but I think that we have the tools as a society to find this common ground and shine a light on the underlying systemic issues in society.
Thank you, Shawn. So, with that being said, lastly, I'd like to bring our attention to how Indigenous groups have had increasingly more detrimental experiences with extreme heat in comparison to non-Indigenous or settler residents. So, as a result of the heat wave, the effects of wildfires increased significantly, with residents of Lytton, BC facing total evacuation last summer. So, as for Indigenous peoples across BC, I like to focus on an Indigenous perspective and how they have often been overlooked in dealing with such issues. So, Sarah Dixon Hole, a doctoral candidate at the University of British Columbia in the Faculty of Forestry, points out how governments usually respond to Indigenous groups after they have dealt with such extreme circumstances, such as wildfires. So, Indigenous Indigenous reserve chiefs have called for a proper firefighting crew to work alongside the reserves to ensure proper safety measures are taken in the case of an event like such, and even recommended training community members in firefighting. But the BC government has not answered any of these demands. Instead, settler colonial views continue to be applied to Indigenous peoples, despite their active denial of such perspectives. Now, in relation to media literacy, I like to point out how only relying on government sources for updates or awareness of climate issues would have led to a complete unawareness of how Indigenous groups are vulnerable to such heat due to the negligence of the government in the first place. Now, based on our discussion of Indigenous and homeless groups and their experiences and lack of acknowledgement of these groups in media, I'd like to ask a question to you both, which is, who is usually the main focus or targeted audience for reports of the heat wave or even climate issues in general?
Yeah, as I said earlier, almost all of the CBC news right now under the environment category are articles about the heat. And as Sean said earlier, the articles describing the current situation or giving people advice on how to avoid heat are in the majority, and followed by calls to action and very little else. Yeah, it's ironic that in the articles describing the current situation and giving advice, I hardly see the indigenous groups. Yeah, these situations are, uh, we say, the majority of the people, and the advice is maybe only applicable to this majority. Yeah.
Yeah, the main focus and targeted audience for mainstream media is often older people, especially on the news stations. The majority of young adults and youth do not turn to news stations like CBC to get their information. Like CU said, indigenous groups and other groups that are not seen that are seen, sorry, as minority groups do not get the same amount of screen time as those who are seen in the majority groups. In my opinion, social media is a multi-layered platform where interacting with minority voices is far more accessible than news media.
Thanks. So, to wrap up this episode, I'd like to once again remind our listeners of the importance of utilizing various media platforms. So, like Siu mentioned in our first podcast on flooding, the use of podcasting or media platforms are the greatest weapon against climate inaction. Now, this is especially important towards this episode's discussion, as well as how I previously mentioned how various perspectives can drastically change the focus of a certain issue. So, ranging from a simple acknowledgement to an immersive look into the systemic ways that climate issues affect different groups of people. We can see how varying platforms and perspectives can help us fight against climate inaction through something as simple as sharing information. Thank you for listening.